Welcome to my studio. This is where I'm going to be working. These are recent paintings, still lifes that I've been doing while we've been quarantined. That's a couple of demos from my last portrait class. That's a master copy of Malay. And there's a bunch of other paintings in the studio. Lots of paintings. Yeah, there's more paintings around, but yeah. Anyway, so this is where I will be focusing today. So I'm just going to give you a quick lesson in one of the elemental ways of formulating a work of art. So for representational painting, you're often or always looking for some sort of aesthetically powerful organizing principle. And turns out that in Colorado, we have lots of sun. One of the very common, obvious principles that people can use to organize a painting is light and shadow. So I'm going to show you the structure of light and shadow. So I've got ivory black and titanium white on my panel, and I'm going to imagine that I'm painting an egg, and the egg is being lit by light that comes in from this direction. And so I'm going to paint it in light and shadow, and I'm going to start by knocking in a dark. And I'm not going to go all the way to black because I want to have room to make adjustments. So this will be a good dark value. And so in light and shadow, in the light and shadow structure, the most important thing is that there be a strong value distinction between the light shape and the shadow shape. And I'll probably say that once or twice more. So the egg is being lit from over here, and so it is in shadow here. And then the egg casts a shadow on, say, the tabletop that it's sitting on. And that cast shadow comes like this. Something like that. And so now I've got a shadow shape. Everything that is not shadow is going to be light. So I'm going to grab another brush for my light shapes. And again, for lights, I'm not going to go white because for the same reason I want to have room to make adjustments. But I need a value that is significantly lighter than that. So something like that. So everything that is not shadow is light. Okay. And from the very start of the painting, when I start the blocking in, from here on out, I'm going to be adjusting the drawing. So this is where I'm looking past the egg into the light struck tabletop beyond it. Everything is light. And then this is my first interesting place. This is a soft edge as the egg transitions from light to shadow. And I get my light, egg in light, and tabletop beyond it in light. No difference, they're both in light. And then down here, I'm looking past the egg in shadow to the light struck table beyond it. And then in here I get to my cast shadow. And cast shadows have hard edges when they're close to the object that casts the shadow. And in class I would do a quick demo of this. I'm going to sort of reestablish this with maybe a little better drawing. Hard edge close to the object that casts the shadow. Hard edge close to the object that casts the shadow. And then the farther the distance from the object casting the shadow to the shadow, the softer that edge is going to get. It's still going to be relatively hard, but it gets softer off here in the where the egg casting the shadow is far from the shadow that it casts. Okay, so I have two shapes now. I've got a light shape and a shadow shape. It's actually a little more complicated than that because my shadow shape is actually made up of two shapes. It's the form shadow right here, and then the cast shadow, which has a softer edge back there in the distance. And so light, shadow, form shadow, cast shadow. Now, all of this is relatively simple and easy to paint and understand, and there's lots of paintings that I've done where this is the entirety of the painting. I don't need anything more complicated than this. But the light and shadow structure does get more intricate. And so this is the first bit of intricacy, and this is dangerous. So, as I said in the beginning, the most important thing in a light and shadow painting is that there be a strong value contrast between the light shape and the shadow shape. So now I'm going to add a reflected light that bounces off the tabletop into the underside of the egg. And the danger in putting in reflected light is that you can poke holes in your shadow shape and destroy the integrity of the shadow shape. But so what's important is that this still read as one shape. Okay, so there's my reflected light. And there's a few interesting characteristics of the reflected light. So the reflected light is going to be lightest and hardest edge where it's close to the source of the reflected light. So down in here. And then it's going to fall off in strength, that is to say in lightness, as the inverse of the square of the distance from the light source, in this case the tabletop. You don't need to remember that, but it just falls off really quickly as it gets far away from the light source. That you do need to remember. So let me try to paint what I'm talking about. It's lightest down here, and then it falls off in strength as the egg curves away from the source of the reflected light here. Okay. And so the reflected light has a hard edge at the bottom where you're looking from the reflected light into the cast shadow. But then as the egg slowly curves away from the reflection, you get what's called the shadow core. The shadow core is defined by the reflected light, and it is the average value of the shadow and it is bounded on both sides by soft edges. So it runs into the transition from light to shadow where it has a soft edge, and it runs into the reflected light where it has a soft edge. And the size of the reflected light and the shape of the reflected light are determined by the curve of the object that they are on. So this is going to describe the kind of egginess of my egg. And notice I'm sort of noodling with the drawing, trying to get this to look a little more eggish. There we go, something kind of like that maybe. Light edge at the bottom, hard edge at the bottom. But notice how this value is still significantly darker than this light value. Okay, so now, oops, that is one of the dangers. That's why I've got two brushes, one brush for the shadows, one brush for the lights, and you don't want to make a mistake and mix them. Okay, so now I've got light shape, shadow shape, form shadow, cast shadow, reflected light, and shadow core. That's about it for the shadow shape at the moment. So let me go into the light. So in the light, I've got the transition from light to shadow, which is typically a soft edge, and it'll be harder or softer depending on the speed at which the object turns away from the light. So a quick curve is going to have a harder edge, and then a slow curve is going to have a softer edge. So for instance, on a face, the forehead is this long, slow curving surface, and typically breaks into shadow with a very soft edge. Whereas the nose is a much more quickly turning curve. And so if there's a light that breaks into shadow at the nose, then that'll be a much harder edge than the edge on the forehead. Then I've got, so the transition. The other thing about the transition is this is typically where you're going to see the most intense colors. And the reason for that is that the color of the object, of the subject in the light, is going to be strongly affected by the color of the light. So if it's sunlight, that's going to be a warm orangish color that's going to really color the shape, the color that you see in the light. And then in the shadow, it's going to be strongly affected by whatever's bouncing into it with a reflected light, or whatever's around to fill the shadow core. And the shadow cores, typically because they're darker, are not going to seem as intense as the lights. So the place where the actual, what we would call local color of the object has the most influence on what you see is going to be on the transition from light to shadow. And that's going to be where you're going to see the most intense colors, typically. Then in the lights, you get a central light. Oops, I reached to my other palette here. I should be just using this. And the central light is where the object faces the light and is closest to the light source. And so it's going to have the full color of the light. And that's going to be right about there. And the central light will oftentimes have a hard edge, especially if it's towards the edge of an object. So I'm saying the egg is most lit there. But it will oftentimes have soft edges. Okay, now very typically when I do this demo, if I do it well, my subject hasn't looked like an egg up until I put in that central light. And then that central light makes the egg kind of appear. And that's a wonderful thing about the light and shadow shape, which is that I'm not worried about painting eggs or eyes or noses or trees. I'm just interested in painting the shape. And if I paint the shape well, at some point it will resolve itself into the object that I'm painting. However, notice that there are places where I've got soft edges. So for instance, this light shape in the background meeting the light shape on the egg, this is a wonderful place for a soft edge, and it creates a kind of unity for this whole shape where the egg isn't cut out. The egg is fully integrated into the painting. And then I often like to try to find other excuses for soft edges. So even though I've got this reflected light, I'm going to try to break that reflected light here and just unify this shadow shape. And where a shadow shape meets a shadow shape, where a dark meets a dark, that's oftentimes a very nice excuse for a soft or even a lost edge. So there we go. Getting rid of a little bit of that reflected light. Okay, so I've got central light, I've got transition, I've got light, and then notice that I called this central light and not highlight. So the reason for that is that the central light is dependent on the relationship of the object and the light, and that's it. So no matter where you are in the room, if you look at the egg being lit by this light, that central light is going to be right there. The reflection or the highlight is going to be different. So the highlight is actually a reflection of the light, and that's going to be in a place where the angle from the light to the object is the same as the angle from the object to your eyes. In geometry, you would say reflecting angles are equal. And so what that means is that it depends on the place that the artist is when the artist is looking at the object. So what that means is that while you can judge the structure of the rest of the things in your painting by stepping away from your easel and getting a good look at your subject and getting a good look at your painting, when you're judging the highlight, you need to do that from the place that you're making all of your drawing decisions. So eggs tend to be pretty matte, but I'm going to pretend that this is a glossy egg. And so for the purposes of pedagogy, I'm going to pretend that there's a highlight on it, that this is a nice glossy, it's been waxed and polished for some reason. It's getting ready for, I don't know, Easter or something. So I've got a highlight there. Now, so highlights are actually reflections. And so what that means is that highlights are going to be smaller, brighter, and harder edged depending on the glossiness of the surface that they occur on. Okay, smaller, brighter, and harder edged. So I'm going to just see if I can give you a little bit of an example. So here you can see the highlights on this, and notice how it moves. Well, that's actually the wrong example. That's precisely the wrong example. So the shadow that this casts is going to be independent of the position of the viewer, but the highlight will move. So notice how the highlight is right here in front of my thumb a little and right here behind my thumb a little. But that wouldn't happen if the highlight stayed still. So highlights depend on the relationship between the light source, the object, and the object and you, whereas the entire rest of the structure of light and shadow depends just on the structure of the light and the object, the subject of the painting. So I've got a strong highlight there. There we go. And I've gotten some white paint in my fingers. Oh, I was using my other palette. Again, cheating, sorry. Okay, and then there's one last thing. So let me recapitulate. So I've got light, shadow, form shadow, cast shadow, reflected light, shadow core, and that's it for the shadow so far. Then I've got shadow, then I've got transition into the light, I've got central light, and I've got highlight. Then there's one other thing which you'll occasionally see, and that's what I call dark accent. And a dark accent is going to be a place where no light can get in to bounce out. So, for instance, on a face, there can oftentimes be a kind of canyon that occurs where a neck meets dark hair, and the dark hair will fall over the neck, and no light can get in, no light can get out. Or a crease where an arm meets a torso. No arm's going to bounce, no light's going to bounce in there, no light's going to bounce out. That's going to be a dark accent. Or if you're doing a close enough version of a portrait, then the iris, then the pupil in the iris is actually can be a dark accent. But so I'm going to pretend, typically on an egg with a light tabletop, is a light, everything in here is light. You're not going to really get a strong dark accent. But again, for the purposes of pedagogy, I'm going to pretend that I'm getting a dark accent down here. So there are two things in this painting that are not accurate portrayals of the situation you would typically get if you had an egg sitting on a plate with direct light on it, and that is the highlight and the dark accent. But I'm going to actually just see if I can I'm afraid that the reflected light isn't really reading that well. So let me just see if I can get some reflected light to read. Okay. Yeah, that's much more strong. And now you can see how dangerous it is. This is almost at the limit of where if it were any lighter, it might read as a light shape. But right now, it still reads, I think, broadly speaking, as a shadow shape. And it's got a soft edge as it curves away from the light. So there we go. This is a little better. So now I think maybe you see something of the shadow core coming down. And so this structure is really useful for designing an aesthetically powerful painting in situations which you see very often in Colorado, where you have naturally occurring lost edges where a light meets a light, and subtle shapes that create the object, shapes like the central light. And then the object emerges as an aesthetically compelling object of paint. So that is basically a significant part of the first class I would give you if you were to take one of my beginning classes. I would also talk some about the technical parts. Yeah, I'm not really happy with my shadow shape here. Let's see, I think the egg's gonna kind of curve more. And actually, maybe it'll come out a little farther. The shadow will come out a little farther, and the light will. Yeah. Yeah. However, this is made up, so I can't really tell for sure. Okay, so I hope that this has been interesting. I hope that this helps you in your artistic practice, which during these days I think is very important for maintaining a sense of sanity, which it's important to be physically healthy, to keep your distance from people who you might infect or might infect you, so as to preserve your health and the health of the people you know and love. It's also important to do what you can to stay mentally and emotionally healthy for your sake and for the sake of the people you love. So, there you go. An egg in light and shadow. I'm still not loving the shadow shape. It's probably gets a little thinner over there, see? And yeah, so there's technical stuff that I didn't talk about. So for instance, what's happening here, where we go from the hard edge in the cast shadow to the edge getting a little softer, is the same thing that happens in astronomy. When we had the eclipse a few years ago, you may remember that Colorado had a partial eclipse. We were in what's called the penumbra, and the penumbra is this area right here that's sort of, well, the soft edge to the shadow, where you're not quite in the full light and you're not quite in the full shadow. And so that's what this is. And the penumbra is going to be more pronounced the farther you are from the object that casts the shadow. So the penumbra from the moon to the earth is quite large, and all of Colorado was in that penumbra. But on this egg, it doesn't get to be that long. And on clouds, occasionally you'll start to when a cloud starts to cast its shadow across you, you'll notice the sun getting a little darker before you get into the full shade. And yeah, so there you go, an egg in light and shadow. Thank you for watching.